Hello and welcome to the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show. Today is a deep dives episode. I am your host, Nick Agar Johnson, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Paige Otto. Normally, I have a standard boilerplate line to say, but today, because of time zones, it's slightly different. So, Paige, how are you this fine early afternoon/morning?
I'm great. It's the last day of 2025. Get to spend it with you, Nick, talking basketball. So, what a better way to end off the year and start of 2026?
That sounds more like a punishment to me, honestly, but I'll take the compliment.
We have to find the things that give us joy, you know.
There you go.
Thinking about the past year, and this is a good way to end it, I think.
Well, everybody listening to this will be listening to it in 2026, and for our Australian and New Zealand friends, it will already be 2026 when we're recording this. So, fun times for you. But we have a couple of great prospects to cover today, and then, spoiler alert, for our quick hits section, we have our first mailbag-esque question, a fan-submitted question. So that's going to be a real fun one to cover in quick hits. But before we get to quick hits, let's do our deep dives. Ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so the first player that we are going to talk about today was your selection, and someone who has been one of, if not the hottest commodity of the last month of college basketball. And it's funny because, as has been referenced in previous episodes, the article that I have been talking about for weeks is finally actually going to come out on the day that this podcast releases, and it features Illinois guard Andrei Stojakovic, but we're here to talk about a different Illinois guard who has absolutely burst on the scene, and on a team that has no shortage of NBA caliber prospects, Keaton Wagler has cemented himself as maybe the best prospect on the Fighting Illini. If not, then certainly up there. So he's been a revelation who very quickly, if not already, is sort of moving himself out of the usual deep dives category. So it seems pretty clear, but I'll ask the question anyway. What made you decide to go with Keaton Wagler for today's episode?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of, hit all the points, right, of why I wanted to talk about him. But he's one of the hottest names in the draft cycle so far, and good reason for it as well. For those that don't really know much about Keaton Wagler, he was a 4-star recruit out of Shawnee Mission Northwest High School in Shawnee, Kansas. Was a Gatorade Kansas Player of the Year, also led his school to back-to-back state titles. And he's also the team leader in points per game on Illinois. He's averaging 15.3 points per game, 5.2 rebounds, 3.8 assists on 46, 42.2, and 82.4 shooting splits. And the thing about Keaton Wagler, Nick, is that he wasn't in the starting lineup to start, but he was a starter because of injury, and obviously with all the production and everything he's done, he's cemented himself as a starter, right? But the one thing about him that basically, has been like the talk of, the draft Twitter or, whatever, is that his production and playmaking ability with how much he's being used by Brad Underwood is absurd. I mean, if you dive into the numbers, right, he has a 2.88 assist to turnover ratio, had 2 games with 10 assists with less than 3 turnovers, also has gone to the free throw line 10 or more times in 3 games. A very, very, I would say, he's not the most athletic, right? But he's very slithery. He's very crafty. Even as a freshman, he really has a tune for getting to his spots in the mid-range. And he's an absurd shooter, 3-level scorer, right? I would say one of the things with him, though, is that, he's on the skinny side, right? He's 6'6", 185 pounds on film. I think that's about right. Very long and lanky, too. I think that also is a plus, but also kind of a negative, too, because it kind of seems like he's growing in his body, too, right? He's younger. But also with that, too, with his production being so high at his age and, how much he's relied on by this Illinois offense is kind of a plus, too, because there's so much room for growth, and his potential is just off the charts just because of the hot start that he's had for, Illinois. The other thing I wanted to mention about why I chose him too is that he has such an enticing offensive package. You know, he can shoot, he can pass, he can score off the dribble. You know, he has a lot of I would say one of the things about him too, Nick, that not is like a concern, but you know, he's very predictable because, you know, most of his drives too are in the pick and roll. He really needs a screen to get going and get downhill. You know, he makes a lot of passes out of the short roll to and off ball screens. And that really, you know, allows him to do kind of whatever he wants. But I would definitely like to see a lot more, you know, isolation and creating his own shot. He already does enough of that, but he definitely leans more, you know, on those pick and roll, you know, possessions to kind of, you know, influence the game more. But with him too, I think with him being so great in the pick and roll already as a freshman too, you know, he's shooting 65% at the rim. He does struggle, you know, with contact. He kind of diverts away from it, especially when, you know, he's coming off a ball screen, gets to his spot in the mid range. And then, you know, he kind of struggles when the defense collapses on him and kind of gets a little rushed that way. But for him, you know, having a 2.88 assist to turnover ratio with, you know, just under a 20% usage rate as a freshman is crazy, right? He doesn't make a lot of mistakes, and the mistakes that he doesn't really look as sped up, right? I think he just tries to do a little bit too much in those situations, especially when he's trying to hit, you know, the roll man a lot with lobs or those kick out passes. And, you know, his playmaking bag, like that he makes absurd kickouts too, to the weak side. And, you know, his processing ability, I definitely think has taken a leap during this streak that he's been on too. Not even like the first pass he makes, but the second pass too, to kind of get, you know, the hit ahead or the, you know, the go one more pass, as we like to call them too. But yeah, I mean, he's been super fun to watch. And I'm excited, you know, as the season goes on to see, you know, if he can keep this streak alive.
Yeah, he has a remarkably complete, filled out offensive game for any prospect, but, you know, particularly for a prospect as young as he is. I mean, you mentioned the 3-level scoring, and really the only nitpick I have with his sort of offensive arsenal at this point is he doesn't have all too many counters at this point. Like his, you know, again, all a lot of this comes with small sample size warnings, even though we're, you know, pretty, I mean, he's played 13 games at this point, right? That's a decent percentage of the college season, even if only a couple games are in conference play at this point. But he's taken 8 runners this season and he's made 1 of them. Mm-hmm. And, you know, a lot of that is mitigated by the fact that he's great at shooting off the dribble. I mean, he's 77th percentile per synergy on dribble jumpers. And that's something that I think about a lot with, you know, call it what you will positionally, but primary initiator types on offense, right? Like guys who are going to have the ball in their hands a lot. And, you know, some of those guys are score first, score second, score third types, right? I mean, you know, we talked about Cam Thomas in our previous episode as someone who sort of fits that archetype, and John Blackwell in comparison to him, right? But one of the major differences with Keaton Wagler, first of all, as you mentioned, is incredibly efficient as a playmaker for others as well, right? He's not just someone who can set up his own looks and knock them down. He, you know, that 2.88 assist turnover ratio you mentioned, he is getting better at, you know, sort of that second and third level of passing mastery of not just can you make the simple reads and hit the passes that you need to, but, you know, can you start to make those more complex reads that, you know, second side passing, as you mentioned, he's not quite at the level where he's passing guys open yet, like the, you know, real passing maestros are. But I mean, the pick and roll proficiency, as you mentioned, absurd. I mean, he's in the 96th percentile on pick and roll ball handling offense this season. And when you factor in possessions plus assists, his already exceptional 88th percentile offensive ranking jumps to 95th, right? So he's not like your Lou Williams, Jamal Crawford type. And I loved watching Jamal Crawford play, but, you know, in terms of him creating looks for others outside of the famous Blake Griffin lob, that wasn't really a major part of his game, whereas it is for Waggler, which, especially when you add in the fact that he's 6'6", and hopefully the frame will fill out over time, he doesn't have the broadest shoulders, which, you know, it's a question of exactly how much good weight he can put on. But, you know, he's clearly going to put on some weight. I mean, he's not going to be at 185 for his entire NBA career. I feel pretty confident in saying that one. So, the fact that he's already got at least the off the dribble shooting as sort of a counter when teams trying to force him into mid-range shots, that's a really good sign. Would love to see him do a little bit more in terms of, it's something we've talked about quite a bit, right? And it's also the sort of main source of the 82 game versus 16 game arguments of like, okay, once you get to the playoffs, your favorite looks will be taken away. Your second favorite looks will also be taken away, right? What are you going to do to counter that? And the fact that he's already as good at the rim as he is, despite being a below the rim athlete, he has precisely 0 dunks this season. Yeah. But even still, he's got great body control, which, shows up across his offensive profile, but is most important in terms of his at rim scoring. Because again, when you're a below the rim athlete who has weight/strength concerns like he does, the fact that he's already this proficient at finishing around the basket is an incredibly positive sign. So again, I only bring up the runner thing just because that's sort of the next step for him to take offensively, but he has a much more complete offensive game than the majority of prospects who are likely to get drafted in this year's draft. I mean, I don't want to put a precise number on it now because it's early, and also he has, had this sort of blow up where, it could be that he cools down towards the end of the season and some of these numbers don't look quite as good. But in terms of just, okay, what is the defense going to throw at me and what am I going to do to counter it? He's already shown an incredible proficiency to score at all 3 levels and when forced into non-ideal situations. So, the runner is sort of a thing to put a pin in going forward, but overall the offensive game is already incredibly well filled out.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you kind of mentioned, he doesn't have many counters, right? And he's, the next step is, to get that floater or, baby hook. And just to mention, type of counters too in the mid range, he's only 26% on pull-ups and floaters as well. So that's just another level of him to unlock because, he's absurd, 3-point shooter, right? He's shooting 42% from 3 on, 9.2 attempts per 100 possessions, right? Yeah. And a lot of those possessions too, he's either, coming off a ball screen, relocating or, getting to his own spots as well. And I don't know who it was on Twitter, but I'm curious your opinion, Nick. Someone compared him to SGA. Just because of, how his pace of play, right? He uses his IQ. He knows he's not, the strongest guy out there, right? He uses his skill set, his mobility, and, he kind of manipulates the defenses that way, right? One thing I do want to mention too is that in the predictability of his game that I was talking about earlier, he really relies on that, spin dribble a little bit too much. And that kind of causes a lot of people just to guess, where he's going a lot. Not saying, he doesn't have, the tweener, behind the back, other counters to his game and his offensive bag, especially off the dribble. But I see him a lot, leaning on that a little bit too much. And that just goes to show, he just needs to, he's relying on what has been working for him, over the stretch. But, that's going to kind of fade out, right? I don't know to like what extent. Or, as we get more into conference play, we get closer to March Madness and, he's, going to be up against, a lot of better teams, right? And, against Connecticut, he only had 3 points, right? It was, I believe, like 3 of 5. So, I mean, it's going to take some getting used to of just, what is the defense going to throw at me? They know I rely on, a couple moves here and there, but how am I going to, impact the game otherwise? Because they know the ball is going to be in my hands most of the time.
Yeah. So just quickly, the UConn game, he did go 1 for 3. He also had really bad foul trouble. He only played 14 minutes. So I think that's a huge factor in that. I do want to go back to the SGA comparison. I do my very, very, very best to never compare prospects to MVPs just because you set expectations way too high when you do that. Like the 5 or so years when every undersized defensive big man was compared to Draymond Green was unfortunate for a lot of players. I think of him more, and again, I'm being incredibly hypocritical based on what I'm about to say, but I think of him closer to James Harden than SGA. I mean, his 3-point attempt rate is 50.8. He takes the majority of his shots from 3-point range. He also gets to the free throw line an absurd amount. The Harden thing doesn't quite work in terms of the frame because Harden was jacked the moment he entered the NBA, and Keaton Wagler is not there yet. That's an understatement of the century. But I always, when people think of SGA, my first instinct is always to go to Karis LeVert instead, because the thing that always stood out to me the most about Karis LeVert was he just had a funky dribbling rhythm and it threw people off constantly, and he knew exactly how to take advantage of that. And so, SGA is the ultimate version of that kind of player. Somewhere between SGA and James Harden is the ultimate version of that kind of player. And I don't want to set the bar too high for Keaton Wagler, but I think Tarris LeVert is a solid comparison. He's had more down years 3-point shooting wise in the NBA than not, and so that's where the comparison falls apart a little bit. But a lot of the sort of stuff that Wagler does of throwing people off, Hezzy's in a way that create more space than you think they should because the defense is either under anticipating or over anticipating how much he's going to move on it. That kind of thing. Again, my go-to is always Caris LeVert, just because I watched him a ton on his early years with the Nets, but also because James Harden and SGA is a really high bar for any prospect to meet. But certainly in terms of what Wagler's done so far, he's been remarkably impressive on the offensive end. Defensive end, a bit more of a mixed bag. So I'm curious for your thoughts on sort of his defense. I think a lot of the problems that he has on defense are frame related. Like, he really struggles getting around screens. The athleticism concerns that we mentioned, he's gotten really good at adjusting for it, especially in terms of his at rim finishing. He's not quite there in terms of adjusting for relatively limited athleticism on the defensive end. So I think given how polished his offensive game is, he'll get quite a few chances to figure out the defensive stuff, but he's got a long way to go on that end, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's, his size and frame, just because he is, I will say, he does have, big mobile hands, which does help him in terms of, disrupting passing lanes and, rebounding too. I don't think he's a bad rebounder at all. I just think, because he is so skinny and like he's more of a guard, right? He's listed as a wing, but he's more of a 1-2 guard, right? That needs the ball in his hands. But I think too, if you look at Andre, he has no problem getting switched on to 1 through 4, right? But with Keaton, you kind of want him to just be 1 through 3, right? Because he's gonna get taken to work if he's underneath the basket, just because of his size at the moment. But I'm not worried about, him, at least gaining, 10 to 15 pounds of muscle, because he is also so young. But, definitely, on the defensive end, people know they can, run through him, right? They're not going to really have a problem, taking it to him, especially if he's switched on. And I think, because he is, athletic, horizontally, he's not the biggest, vertical athlete too. I think his footwork is good. That's definitely a plus on that side of the column, especially on the weak side as well. And also in transition too, I think he does a really great job getting back as well. And I think honestly, he does his best to, be a defensive threat, but it's not quite there, right? Because he is, so reliant on the offensive end of the ball that, and he's so hot, right? And he, is doing all the right things on the offensive end. Is kind of like, the defense kind of comes second right now, because kind of that's what, Brad Underwood needs of him. And one thing I saw too from 247 Sports that I was curious about, I saw it on Twitter, but it's an article on 247 Sports about Keaton. I think it was on Media Day. So Brad Underwood said Wagler was a similar level prospect as Will Riley and Kasper Yakachunas, who in June, obviously, they became the first one-and-done draft picks, in Illinois history. And, he went on to say a lot of great things about Boswell as well. And mentioned, Wagler's parents didn't really think that, Wagler was going to be, as such an impact at this level too. They're kind of shocked of like how much trust Brad Underwood had in him, in coming to the season. They didn't think he was going to, be kind of, the star for him freshman year, which is kind of a cool story. You guys can find it on 247 Sports if you want to read the whole thing. But that also, is a, very good feeling too when your coach is, saying such great things about Keaton Wagler, because if you guys have watched college basketball and aside from the draft, Brad Underwood is a hard coach, right? He is known kind of for his temper, and he's also known for his development, especially in guard prospects, right? So I think that's also a plus in that he mentioned a lot of times in the article too. A lot of people think just because of Keaton's size, he's not as strong or tough, but he's tougher than you think. It's like, look what I asked him to do, and he's exceeding expectations, game in and game out. So I thought that was a definitely plus to see too, especially from Coach Underwood.
Yeah, I think there's a important distinction there between strong and tough, in the sense of strength-wise, he's at a deficit. I can't really think of a way around that, to be entirely honest. But
yeah,
in terms of, again, it's something of like watching Chet Holmgren in high school and at Gonzaga, and he's still ridiculously skinny, but back then he was even skinnier. That had absolutely no impact on how hard he was trying on the defensive end and how willing he was to try guys on the defensive end, right? And, we've talked about it before. We'll talk about it again. Because effort is such a huge part of defense, and Waggler is at least trying, I think that's a huge part of the puzzle. That probably is in no small part related to Brad Underwood trusting him as much. There's a big difference between, hey, I know I'm going to get beat defensively quite often, but, at least I'm going to put in the effort. That endears you to a coach a lot more than, yeah, I'm just at a deficit here, so, oh well, plan around me, figure it out. And, I do want to go back to the 1 through 3 thing, because I'm curious your thoughts on this. I think of Waggler as more of a 2-3 defender than a 1 through 3. And part of that, I think, is because I'm increasingly valuing point of attack defense and prospects. But part of it also is, for as much better as Waggler is laterally than he is vertically in terms of his athleticism, I don't buy him sticking in front of NBA level point guards, like the real quick point guards. And the good news for him is, because he's 6'6", you can put him 2-3 and not have it be much of a problem, right? The difference between Waggler and Janai Mobley on that front is you kind of have to stick Mobley on the point guard because he's only 6'1". And so, if he can't be good enough as a point of attack guy, then you're really struggling in terms of, okay, what do we do with him defensive assignment rise, right? For Waggler, it's asinine to say it again and again, but the fact that he's as big as he is means, okay, as long as we don't have like a really bulky wing, right? Like, I don't want him on Franz Wagner, but generally speaking, if he's 2-3 rather than 1 through 3, I think that's a much more likely version of where he turns out to be good enough defensively, right? He's not someone who's going to earn his money at the next level on the defensive end. But, as we've mentioned time and time again, you need to at least be good enough on that end to get on the floor, right? And the fact that he's already earned Brad Underwood's trust is, I think, a huge positive sign of, again, part of the reason why scouting is so difficult is because there's a whole ton of all of this, the development, the willingness to be coached, et cetera, that happens behind the scenes. And unless you've got a real in at Illinois, you don't exactly know how all of that stuff is going. But for a coach who has a notoriously tough reputation to trust a 4-star guy like Waggler to come in and immediately be the leading scorer on this Illinois squad, it says a lot about the willingness that the coaching staff has to trust him, generally speaking. And I think a lot of that is predicated on, hey, if you don't buy in defensively, maybe we're not going to give you that kind of trust. Whereas if you're struggling but trying defensively, that's, first of all, it's a lot easier to project someone turning themselves into an adequate defender if they're putting in the effort versus, I have to hope that he's going to want to care on the defensive end at some point, right? That's not the thing with Waggler. But, again, especially since he's this blazing comet of a star hitting the 2026 NBA draft scene, I don't like nitpicking prospects in general, and I really don't like it for younger prospects who, happen to have a heater of a run. But his draft stock will be dramatically determined by whether he can stay this hot on the offensive end. And if he can, he's probably a lottery pick, even if the defense doesn't show any improvement. But there is sort of a baseline, obvious question of, hey, do you care about this enough to try? And if you do, odds are good that you're going to improve a lot more than someone who says, nah, I don't really care.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, he can't stay this hot forever. I mean, maybe he can, a little bit, but I think, we've seen these runs, go, I don't know. So like Terquavion Smith, right, from NC State a couple years back, he was on this insane run from three, right? And a lot of people, kind of were talking about him like, Keaton Wagler. Obviously, Keaton Wagler has a lot more playmaking feel than, Terquavion did. But, similarity into, this microwave scoring, streak that, his kind of, fell off a little bit. But, there's a lot of conversations of like, I think Terquavion, he was also smaller than, Keaton too,
yeah,
right?
I was going to say Keaton also had 2 inches and like 35 pounds on Turk.
Yeah. But, still skinny, 3-level scorer that, can get hot in a hurry and has, a lot of offensive juice too. But, we saw his, run kind of come to an end a couple years ago. But same thing. It's like, oh, he can go, first round, where the case may be. But, they're not the same prospect, right? It's just similarities and, trajectory and, in college basketball as well. But I think with him too, the reason I said, he could be, 1 through 3 guard is that I think if he adds, 10 to 15 pounds of muscle too, I would like him to, have some on ball, point of attack reps, defending those faster, stronger point guards, right? Especially in, more at the college level too. Like, as we get into conference play, obviously Colin Boswell is a perfect example of like who I would want him to like go against, right? Just because of the strength ability. And that, I can't imagine, what practices are like, when they're on each other. I think that'd be super fun to watch. But I think that would be, good for him too. And not just, having him just out there, on the 2-3 spot and kind of, if he switched on, a point guard, he's kind of like, oh my God, like you're going to leave me off the dribble. So I think, just adding that, to the defensive end as well. Not that that would be like his main priority as, guarding, the one guards, right? But I think just having that as, rely on a little bit, so he's not as much of a liability at the point of attack would be good too. And I think, I think if he keeps this up, he's definitely looking, in lottery range because, he has that grittiness and toughness to him on the defensive end of the ball, which is, that's kind of all you can ask for, right? When, you're a freshman with, the offensive juice that he has and, the playmaking vision and creativity there. But I also, wouldn't be surprised either if, he came back a second year to Illinois and, increased his draft stock even more and was a true breakout, sophomore as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Usually for me, I think of a couple of people specifically of I think prime examples of, hey, maybe you should return to school as that kind of guard is I think of Jaden Ivey, I think of LeBaron Philon, I think of guys who are better shooters than they got to show in their freshman season coming back and saying, hey, actually I can shoot and all the other stuff I did last year, I can still do all of that stuff. So, in that regard, I think Wagler's a fascinating conversation because, if he continues like this, it would be difficult for him to improve his stock all that dramatically other than, hey, next year's draft class is probably going to be weaker. And also, just the very basic amount of, hey, if I do it twice, that's a bigger sample size than if I do it once, right? So if I come back for year 2 and I do all this again, that's, very encouraging from an NBA front office perspective. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Shall we shift gears completely and go to player number 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I mentioned this to you before we started recording, but I think it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to come up with 2 more different players for today's Deep Dives episode. So you went with a Blazing Comet, incredibly hot stock, young freshman, very, very skinny, tall guard. And I went with a veteran, been around the draft scene forever, undersized but built like a tree trunk defense first center. So my player for this week is Tarris Reed Jr. out of UConn, who, he's been lingering in second round conversations for quite a while. I mean, going back to, the beginning of his college career at Michigan. And in many ways, he solidified a lot of the sort of bubbling draft stock around him last year with UConn. And then this year, he's played a larger role on the team and been quite successful at doing it. He's one of these players for whom the selling point is very obvious. The breakdown of the game is pretty simple. Yeah, he's 6'10 and he can't shoot. He's also spectacular defensively, moves really well, and also is impossible to move by anybody else. Very effective at the shots that he does take, which are almost entirely at the rim. Like a good just under 2/3 of his shots have been within 3 feet of the basket. And, that's what he's good at. And he knows what he's good at. And he does it very well. And, at a certain point when you get into the second round, teams are going to be looking for, hey, is this guy an NBA player? And there will be plenty of players drafted around where Terrace Reed is drafted this year, who I'm confident will have less lengthy and less successful NBA careers than him. So I've given sort of the baseline pitch, but Paige, what are your thoughts on Tarris Reed Jr.?
Yeah, I think it's, you mentioned it's funny that we picked complete opposites. And this is also not the first time this, year of deep dives too that we've done that. So I think it's, funny on ending off the year like that. But since I live in Michigan, I've been able to see Terrace, play a couple times, a few times, when he was at Michigan his first 2 seasons. And, he was very, in the shadow of, Hunter Dickinson, right? He was very turnover prone as well. Wasn't, as confident as he is now. And I think with UConn, especially with Dan Hurley, he's been, able to shine in a lot of other ways and has been developed a lot more than, he had the opportunity, at Michigan too, right? Under Juwan Howard. With him too, his playmaking has definitely evolved at UConn as well. He's only played, I believe 8 games this season because, he came in with a hamstring injury, then sprained his ankle. So he's been dealing with that. And then he came back, for the Jimmy V Classic against Florida. So, and, you kind of mentioned, he's kind of built like a tree trunk, right? And, he is, right? I think because he is, he's, 6'10", 265 pounds, he's built like a freight train, right? And he's such, a tenacious defender and rim protector. He's very, he's a great role playing, big man in the NBA, right? One that, comes to the top of mind is Adem Bona, right? Because a lot of us were very high on him. Adem Bona, I would give him, over Terrace Reed. He's very more fluid moving, awesome in transition, more vertical than, Terrace is. But I mean, look what he's doing with the 76ers, right? He's playing, over 20 minutes per game the past few games. He's definitely, making an impact, right? And I think that's a perfect role for Reed too. And, obviously Adem Bona's, and, obviously Joel Embiid's shadow, but, it's a great fit for him with being in Philadelphia. And Tarris Reed and Adem Bona, they were kind of going back and forth, right, in that 2023 draft class. So, yeah, I think, there's a lot of things that with him, finally being a senior, I feel like he's been in college forever, it seems like, even though, he's only transferred once, right? But, in his first year at UConn too, he won 6th man of the year. He's just a menace too in the variety of, ball screen coverages that he can, upheld on the defensive end too, right? Dan Hurley, has a lot of like blitzes, hedges, drop coverage, right? And he can excel at all of them pretty easily. And, he's not the fastest, lateral mover, but I think just because of his size and understanding and that, he's not going to wow you from the 3-point line. He's only had 1 attempt this season. And that attempt was, a transition play Silas DeMary, he kind of went coast to coast and then kicked it out at the last second to Reed trailing on the 3-point line. So he's wide open. Shot didn't look terrible. He just is it just is slow, right? Coming off the hand. I mean, he's only shot, 4 3-point attempts in his college career. So, he's not gonna do anything, at that, from downtown yet, but in the post too, he's average, in the low 70s at the rim. He's very patient. I love his footwork there as well. He's amazing at putbacks, right? He's great at following off his teammates miss shots. He's always there, right? And I think with him, I really do like the Adem Bona comparison, just because of a role comparison with him, is that I think he could easily fit in that role coming out of the 2026 NBA draft.
Yeah, Adem Bona is a great comparison for a number of reasons. I mean, they're very similar size, slightly undersized centers who, I mean, in Bona's case, he makes up for it by also being a ridiculous athlete, which Reed isn't quite there, but a lot of Bona's success as well is just also being, stronger than most of the people he's going up against. Not quite at the NBA level to the same degree as it was in college, obviously, but that's a very high bar to clear. But yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the passing stuff with Reed, because that, I think, has been the biggest sort of developmental growth that he's taken over the last couple of years in particular. I mean, you can sort of look at the raw number of, hey, he's averaging twice as many assists as he ever has. But really the thing for me is he's doing that while not making many mistakes. This is his first year with a positive assist to turnover ratio. And the fact that he is being involved more as a playmaker and also is being more effective with the ball in his hands in terms of, not kicking it all over the court, huge sign. And, genuinely for a lot of these sort of big men where it's like, okay, so, you're our dunker spot guy, you're our finisher guy, but, it's one of those things where, I use the term, 0.5 second basketball quite a bit, and we'll continue to, because I think it's instructive of, hey, once the ball swings your way, are you going to either do something or make a quick decision to pass the ball on to somebody else, right? And I am just more confident in Reed making the right read and kicking out to the right guy this year than I ever have been before. And especially for someone who, as you mentioned, he's taken 4 3-pointers in his entire college career. In his most, I'm double checking my numbers here, but in the year where he took the most jump shots of his college career, he took 10 of them. Like, this is not someone who is going to be spacing the floor in any capacity. But, one of the other things that I harp on of free throw percentage and, free throw truthing, he's getting to the line more this year. He's not great at it, but I mean, going from shooting 40% from the line his freshman year to 61% this year, 64% last year, and, to be fair, 59% in his sophomore year, not great. Those aren't the numbers you're hoping for, but there's a big line between the sort of Dylan Mitchells of the world of you miss more than you make versus, like, if he can be 61 to 65%, again, not great, but good enough. There is one other thing this year that I think is, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I think it's more of a scheme thing, but it might also be a sample size thing. It might also be he's been hurt for a lot of the year thing, but this has been his worst year on the offensive glass.
Mm-hmm.
And especially for someone who, as you mentioned, is as great at finishing those putbacks as he is, I would like to see that go back to the levels that it's been at previously. And again, because he's not even played a full season and we're not even like halfway through the season, or given how many games UConn plays, they might be only a third of the way through the season.
Yeah.
But again, that's like a minor concern for me. Again, he's, in terms of total rebounding, this is his best year just because he's been much more effective on the defensive glass, which that and the film I've watched leads me to believe it's probably some combination of not being quite right and a scheme change. But I would be a little bit worried if that continues because, again, putbacks are one of the easiest ways for him to be helpful on the offensive end, in addition to just being absurdly efficient. And I'm much less concerned about his small dip in 2-point percentage this year than I am about the fact that his offensive rebounding has gone the way it has. So I'm curious for your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a scheme thing and also a usage thing too. This is the highest, year in his career, that he's being used, 28% of the time compared to, 22, 20, and 18.7, right? And he's also playing a lot more than he has as well. Obviously, the injuries kind of scare me a little bit just because I've been always a hamstring and then an ankle. And then you can kind of see it too. I think that could be, a good reason too, on the offensive end as well, as why he's not being as, as resilient and efficient as, he, as we know him to be, right? And I also think since he's taken a jump playmaking wise too, I think that's kind of taken away too from, his ability to, crash the glass as much as he has. And I think I think that's going to go up. Not too worried about that just because he's been so effective and, a lot of different ways that, he hasn't been over the past, 3 years as well. But I think too, UConn's 12-1, they're fourth in the country. I think he's just getting acclimated to, the speed and the pace again, coming back from injury, and like hamstring injuries are a pain. They're kind of a lingering injury that, as much as PT as you do, rehabilitation. I can't even say that word. We're gonna cut that out. And all the PT stuff. But I think he's just, kind of taking it easy a little bit, even though, he's only played 8 games. He started obviously all of them. I think he's just taking it a little bit easy on that end and kind of just showing a lot more what he can do on the offensive end, not offensive rebounding, but it's not like a huge, jump, right? It's just, we're expecting, bigger numbers because he is such a force down there. And that's a lot of, his stock is on is because, he's, Tarris Reed, he's, a great rim protector. He's ferocious off the glass. He's huge, right? He's 245 pounds at, 6'10". He's the undersized center, but, he makes up in, his toughness and strength, right? So I think he's not going to have a problem, moving forward. It's just, a good thing to bring up too, being only 8 games of, him playing. But I think in conference play too, I think we'll definitely see those numbers, get back up to, his average.
Yeah, there's also, and this is being way too reductionist, but I do think it's worth pointing out, because he's only played 8 games this year, the fact that Florida absolutely mauled UConn on the offensive glass in that game, and Reed had precisely 0 offensive rebounds. Again, it's only 1 game, but also when you've only played 8 games, 1 game stands out, and UConn got 3 offensive rebounds total in that game, which, when you think about Florida's front line, it's like, yeah, okay, maybe you're not going to do as well rebounding against those guys as you are against, say, I don't know, pretty much anybody else. I mean, certainly in their last game against DePaul, he, 11 rebounds, 3 of them on the offensive glass, effective around the basket. As per usual, only took shots from 2-point range, which, again, shouldn't be all that surprising at this point. But yeah, I think you make a very, very good point in terms of the passing stuff. He's just, positioned higher in the key than he was when he was less of a passing threat. And, just simple geometry / physics, right? It's like, hey, if you're farther away from the basket, it's going to be harder to offensive rebound. And the fact that his defensive rebounding has ticked up accordingly makes it seem like, okay, it's not like he's lost so much lift that he can't rebound anymore, right? It's like, if he's in different places on the court, some things are going to be easier, some things are going to be more difficult. I do want to switch to the defensive end quickly, because this is where I think obviously this is going to, not obviously. I'll retract that. We'll retract rehabilitation and whatever it was that I just said. That absolute mess. But anyway, yeah. In terms of Reed defensively, he's in an interesting place for me because, as we've talked about with Flory Badunga before, and we'll talk about with many prospects before and after, there is a real value to, if you're around that size, being that sort of super switchable defender 4 type. Like, the easy example to pull to mind is Miami Heat era LeBron James, right? Of just, I'm not necessarily guarding any one player, but I'm basically the strong safety. And, you know, I mean, for LeBron, it was almost literally 1 through 5, right? But, for most of these type of players, is like, anybody who's not like a water bug point guard type, I'm going to switch on them. I'm going to wall them off. And that's just going to be that. Terrace Reed isn't quite that, which, even more than his sort of lack of shooting, I think it's the defensive profile to me that kind of pigeonholes him more as an undersized center rather than, hey, maybe this guy can play some 4. And to be clear, I'm not saying that in the right lineup, he couldn't find a way to be effective as, one of 2 big men, especially if a more mobile not even shot blocker, because he's an exceptional shot blocker, but, a more mobile sort of switchable type who, he's been quite good this year. So I'm feeling good about my thoughts on him. But like, Mousa Diabate always stood out to me when I scouted him as, this guy is insanely mobile for how big he is. And there was one possession that I highlighted in the article I wrote about Diabate that I still remember, because he just basically spent 20 seconds switching onto literally every single player on the court. And that's not Terrace Reed. It's close to Flory Badunga, which is why I'm getting increasingly higher and higher on him. Not to mention that the article that I mentioned that's coming out the same day as this podcast, Flory Badunga did better than any of the 5 deep dives prospect on all of those measures. So
let's go.
Gonna have to bump him up my board when we do the next big board rankings this weekend for No Ceilings. But, with Reed, again, it's the kind of thing where he's really, really good if you sort of use him as that last line of defense type of big man. Mm-hmm. And that's very, very good, and also has one sort of smaller drawback. Very, very good in the sense of, hey, every team needs a last line defender, right? The flip side of that is there are fewer contexts where that kind of guy who's a 6'10 center makes sense. And again, the fact that he's as good of a shot blocker as he is, the fact that he's a really solid rebounder, concerns about his offensive rebounding numbers this season aside, it's not that, like Kenneth Faried had very, very good early success. And once he was sort of forced into being more of a center because it started becoming less and less viable for power forwards to not be able to shoot, that sort of spelled the end of his NBA career in a hurry. And Kenneth Faried is more athletic than Tarris Reed. Kenneth Faried was also generously listed at 6'8", right? So that's part of the whole calculus here. But with Reed, it's one of those things where, it would make the projection easier if he was more mobile. But also, if he was more mobile, he's probably a pretty clear first-round guy as opposed to, maybe late end of the first, early second kind of pick. So I don't mean to denigrate his defense by any means. He's very, 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 very good at what he does. But what he does isn't quite as broad of a spectrum as you might want for a 6'10 guy.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points. I will say that he is a little bit more mobile than you would think in terms of him getting out to the perimeter. And I don't think he has as big of an issue that he had, the past few years of, guarding out to the perimeter, especially in pick and pop situations. But I think that's still definitely, a hit in his column, just because I don't know if you think this too, Nick. Like, I think just because of his size and, he's also undersized center, that I think I have trouble with like his mobility, especially since he is, a controller of the paint, as you will, right? I think I'm just a little concerned, and especially because of his injuries too, that, how is this gonna, pay off, at the NBA level, right? Because, he's gonna be asked to do a lot more things that he's doing at the college level. And obviously a small sample size now because he is coming back from injury. I know we keep mentioning that, but it's worth, taking into consideration. But, it does beg the question, is he able to do that, night in, night out, a Dembona, like 20 minutes per game? Is he able to do that, if he switched on to big man that, can shoot the 3 ball really well? And for you guys that watched, last week, Brooke Lopez had, a career night at 3. He made 9 threes, right?
My guy,
And
Brooke Lopez.
yeah. And I forget what episode, we talked about him as a comparison. I know you did, but, his development as a 3-point shooter, right? And, I don't know if Terrace Reed, would have the movement and mobility, to, get out there, every single time, right? Because, given, Brooke Lopez is a little bit taller than Reed too. But I don't know. I think just like processing wise too, I think because he does have like such a high motor that, he's going to defend, the best of his ability, even though he's not, the best perimeter defender, but he certainly can go out there and guard because he is great at getting around screens too. And, he is kind of a force to, kind of drop off, dribble moves, right? Especially if he's, guarding, the 4 or 5. But it's definitely something to, note as we head throughout the season. But I think, if he, takes strides and perimeter defense and, just showing that, he can guard pick and pop guys. He can get around screens a lot more, off the perimeter, but can also, come back and, get those boards that, he's such, a monster at. And have his numbers, kind of climb up back to normal. I think, we're looking at, a pretty good year for, Reed heading into the 2026 NBA draft.
Yeah, the mobility stuff is interesting. I don't mean to imply that he can't do that.
Yeah.
He's solid at that, and I think it's one of those things where it's on the borderline between nitpicking and a problem of like, because he's as good at the things that he does well as he is, it feels a little bit unfair to be like, hey, also be this, hyper switchable type. But it's, it's one of those things where, and I'm pretty sure we've talked about this, you and I. If we haven't, I've definitely talked it to death on other episodes of Deep Dives. But the idea that the tweener used to be like a distinction between are you a 3 or are you a 4? And now I think of tweener as are you a 4 or are you a 5?
Yeah.
And Terrace Reed is that kind of 4 or 5 tweener where it's like, hey, there are a couple things where, and, screen navigation, I think he's really good at that. And I think that's something that will continue because even when you get to the NBA level, he's still going to be a big dude. And it's like, you do not want that guy blowing up your screen, even if he's only 6'10", right? But, it's one of those things where, again, it's like, who will he need to play alongside to maximize his defensive gifts? And, it's okay, so what? Like either a 6'8" hyper switchable guy or a 7-foot plus guy who can shoot threes. Those are literally the rarest commodities in the NBA, right? It's like, so, it's like, well, there are a whole lot of guys who, if only they had that, 7'1" 3-point shooter, it's like, oh, if only we had Brooke Lopez or Miami Heat era LeBron James. It's like, yeah, okay, sure, that'd be fantastic. It's like, oh man, if only we had prime Shaq and Steph Curry on the same team. Like, yeah, that team would probably win a lot of basketball games. But with Reed, again, it's one of those things where he was my toughest cut for the most recent big board. He's going to be quite a bit higher up on this most recent one. And a whole lot of that is driven by his passing improvement, right? And that's not the most important part of his game, but it is something that I feel like he needed to hit a solid baseline with. And I felt like he's reached that this year with the passing. And that opens up a whole lot of the rest of his offensive game, which is exceptionally important for someone who's as much of a non-shooter as he is. The defensive stuff, I mean, his blocks numbers have, they're a career high. I think part of that also is he has 10 blocks in his last 3 games.
Yeah.
Right? That's something where, I mean, I think it's entirely possible that by the end of the year, he's still averaging a little over 2 blocks a game, only playing 24 minutes too, right? And that's the other thing. And you bring up the Adembona 20 minutes a game thing. And that is something I want to key in on here because for someone who is probably going to be a second round pick, that's just my assumption at this point. For someone who's probably going to be a second round pick, a lot of the questions are he's almost certainly not going to start at the next level. And if he does, it's definitely not going to be right away. So then the question is, okay, maybe he can't be that small ball 5 for 20 minutes, but can he do it for 10? And that was the exact logic that led to me bumping Ryan Kalkbrenner from late second round pick to late first round pick last year. And that's looking pretty good so far. And he's doing it in a much bigger sample size than 10 minutes off the bench. But the place where I reach with Ryan Kalkbrenner, and he has the benefit of being a legit 7'1" as opposed to 6'10", but the place that I reached with him was, am I confident that this guy can be a backup center and play 12 minutes a game at the NBA level? Yes, very much so. Where do I value that kind of player? Well, late first, early second, because there are a lot of playoff teams drafting late first, and there are a lot of teams who will sell their picks early in the second to those kinds of playoff teams who are like, we're not looking for the home run swing. We're not looking for the guy who could be an all-star and could be out of the NBA in 3 years. We're looking for, hey, we have a need at backup center. This guy checks a lot of the boxes that we want to have checked. And so it's one of those things where, as much as I think he's much more quote-unquote fit dependent than Keaton Wagler, that's also a problem that will probably solve itself, in the sense that the teams that will draft Terrace Reed are not going to be the teams that expect him to be Miami Heat era LeBron James. They're going to be the teams that need 10 to 12 minutes a game of quality backup center play. And I talk about the Kings all the time because I live in Sacramento and they're the NBA team that I watch by far the most. But last season, the Kings had an adequate backup center for the first time in years for 2 months in Jonas Valanciunas. And suddenly, the offense didn't fall apart when Domantas Sabonis went to the bench. And then they got rid of Jonas Valanciunas, and, thank God for Maxime Reynaud. He's just about the only watchable part of Sacramento Kings basketball these days. But, the idea there being, hey, either you can make this trade for Jonas Valanciunas or pay him $10 million a year, or you can get someone at like the 37th pick who, yeah, maybe their ceiling's not all that high. Yeah, maybe they have those holes where you'd like him to be more switchable defensively. You'd like him to be better than a 61% free throw shooter. You'd like him to be able to take more than 10 jumpers in his most proficient season in terms of shooting. But if that's what you need, that guy is a lot more valuable to you on a second round pick contract than he is on, trying to buy that guy in free agency or trying to swing a trade for him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you, kind of hit the nail on the head with that. And then just to, bring up our latest mock draft, we actually have Tarris Reed going 36 to, you guessed it, the Clippers.
There you go.
So, he's kind of playing with, an older, highlighted more version than him, right? With Zubac, obviously we mentioned Brook Lopez. And one thing I also want to mention too is that since I live in Detroit, when Duren was out, Paul Reed actually, stepped up to the plate and a really, great stretch, right? I forget. Oh yeah, against the Bills in November, he had a 20+ point game and was just super efficient, off the glass, and came in there, and basically did the job, right? When next man up kind of type scenario. And I think Tarris Reed, that's the perfect role with him too, as a role playing big man, and can get 10 to 20 minutes in at night. And if the 5 or 4 star player that's hurt for the team, he could definitely come in and make an impact, because Paul Reed definitely put on a show when Duren was out. So I wanted to mention that as well, because I could see that type of role as well.
Good old b-ball Paul. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Paul Reed is funny just because he in particular stands out to me of, man, wouldn't it be great if some team just played him like 15 minutes a night as opposed to just, you only get this opportunity like once in a blue moon. I mean, yeah, someone who I've been thinking about a lot because of the article that I keep mentioning is Jay Huff, who was one of the NBA comparables that I used. And it's like, every year he shows up on a new team. He's really, really valuable in like 10 minutes a game, and then they move on for him, and he goes somewhere else and is really, really valuable in like 12 minutes a game. And I think he's still leading the NBA in block shots, which is absolutely wild.
Yeah. And also Terrace Reed too. I don't know if you mentioned it, Nick, but he has a huge wingspan, right? 7'4" wingspan, which definitely helps him, as a rim protector. Obviously his block rate with Reed is, absurd too, but with Paul Reed too, right? And obviously on the Clippers, they're kind of stacked, in the front court because, they have DJJ too, Derrick Jones Jr. as well. So kind of if they got Reed, it would kind of be like the mecca for big man.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the wingspan thing. I am sorry to whoever said this, who I remember it from, because I've forgotten who said it, but I will remember the quote until the day that I die. You don't defend shots with the top of your head. You defend them with your hands, right? So wingspan is much more important than height, and wingspan and standing reach are a lot more important than just pure height in terms of these calculations, because you're not contesting shots with your forehead, right? So, and Terrace Reed, again, for all these sort of undersized center concerns, that's something that we can nitpick of, oh, if only he were a better vertical athlete, oh, if only he were a couple inches taller, right? But like, he covers a lot of space defensively, and part of that is that wingspan, as you mentioned. Part of that is his frame. He's a big, he's there are multiple dimensions to size, right? As someone who weighs a little bit more than I'd like to at this point in my life, there's also horizontal, right? And he's not horizontal in the overweight kind of way. He's horizontal in the, oh, this man is a tree trunk kind of way. And all of those not minor, but less obvious sort of parts of the defensive profile, almost all of those are encouraging to me. And it's something where, again, if he finds the right situation, he'll be very, very effective. If teams try to use him in ways that he's not quite equipped for, he'll probably be less effective. But the flip side is that the kinds of teams that are going to buy in on Tarris Reed are the kinds of teams that are like, we know what we're getting and we need that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think just because of, we mentioned, he's been in college for a while. He finally found, his place at UConn, and definitely, he kind of was written off, right, in the 2024 NBA draft. But, obviously was, different role with Michigan, wasn't, highlighted of what, he could do, on the floor. But with UConn, he kind of revived, everything about his game, right? And then he made developmental strides and, his playmaking and everything. And I think there's a real role for him to make an impact with, whatever team he lands on in the 2026 NBA draft. And, if he, stays healthy, right, I think we could be looking at, a different version of Terrace Reed that we've been seeing, only in 8 games too. So I'm definitely excited for that as well.
All right. Shall we move on to our quick hits?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to let you take the lead with this one, because this was all you, and I only caught up on it after the fact. So go for it. Special edition of quick hits.
Yeah, special edition of quick hits. Shout out to Anytime Knicks for kind of giving this mailbag to Nick and I to discuss on our next episode. So shout out for this idea. He wanted us to cover a prospect from Cal Poly, Nick, Hamad Musa. Transfer from Dayton, basically revived his college career and is doing exceptionally well at Cal Poly. Just lighting it up, honestly. He's 6'8", 190 pounds, averaging 20.6 points per game, 5.8 rebounds, 1.8 assists on 45.7, 40.7, 85 shooting splits. And one thing with him, Nick, is, haven't watched a lot of him until, we got that message from Anytime Knicks. But diving into the film, you don't really see a lot of prospects with his size that can, handle the ball the way he can get to spots the way he can. He's just a lights out shooter, and he moves so well, right? And obviously, at Dayton too, let me see his splits real quick. Yeah, I mean, he's playing the most minutes he's ever played. He went from 7.6 to nearly 30 minutes per game. And, he basically, and at Dayton too, in the limited minutes, he didn't start any games, only played 20, but he attempted less than one 3-point attempt per game. And now he's attempting, just a little under 8. So I think with him, too, he's definitely, a prospect to watch out for, just because of his offensive juice and his 3-level, scoring package that he has at his size. And I also, his development from last year to this year is incredible. And, we also talked about a prospect that's kind of on a run too. So I think this is a great quick hits episode, or great way to end this episode too, is talking about Musa.
Yeah, there's a lot of Keaton Wagler similarities for sure. I think the thing, so I watched a little bit of his Dayton film just to sort of set my sort of guidelines for, the deal this season. And again, the sample size on his Dayton 3-pointers is he took 13, he made one. So, not all that much to look through, but the flip side is, hey, it didn't take me all that long to look through all of it. And the thing is, he's got a bit of a slower, kind of low release on the shot, but he is much more consistent with it this year than last season. Like last year, his feet were all over the place, his release wasn't consistent. And so I do buy into the fact that, he has really, really taken a step forward as a shooter. Now, does that mean that he'll shoot 41% on 6.6 3-point attempts per game for the entire season? That I'm less sure about, but I mean, me and my free throw true thing. He's gotten to the line almost 8 times a game. He's hit 85% of them. His most recent game against Idaho, which went to overtime, he did his very, very best to try and save Cal Poly from the loss, and unfortunately wasn't able to. But 33 points, 17 of 19 from the free throw line.
Yeah.
Right. Just that alone is going to skew his free throw percentage pretty high for the rest of the season, and especially given that he took 16 free throws last year at Dayton. Again, all of the Dayton stuff is like incredibly low sample size. He played 151 minutes the entire year. He's well past that already in his 13 games for Cal Poly. So I do really buy into the shooting development, the shooting growth. The form looks better. It's not like textbook form, again, sort of slow, kind of a low release. But when you're 6'8", you can get by with a low release much better than other players. And as you mentioned, the thing that stands out the most is how advanced his handle is and how well he moves for someone who's 6'8". I mean, he can get pretty much wherever he wants, other than he's got an even bigger strength deficit than Keaton Wagler does. And that shows up a lot more on the defensive end than the offensive end. And defense, it's worrying. And the fact that he's 6'8" means that he has a lot more sort of margin for error on that end. I don't know what his wingspan is. I don't have those numbers in front of me. On the film, it looks like slightly plus. Like I would say probably 6'10", 6'11" wingspan, maybe. Like he doesn't have T-Rex arms, but he's also he's not Terrace Reed in terms of like, wow, this guy, really, really stands out of like, yeah, this guy covers a lot of court with his wingspan. The 2-point percentage as well is really encouraging to me. I mean, his at rim numbers are not fantastic, but especially when you can shoot like he can, that's always a very good sign in terms of that. And, he's shooting 51% from 2-point range, which is pretty solid for a guard. I mean, especially for a guard who takes, a decent number of mid-range shots. He's shooting 56% at the rim, which again, slightly below average, but and he's a guard at 6'8", right? He's not like, maybe this guy's a wing, maybe, I don't know. He's an okay passer. He turns the ball over a lot more than I'd like. Definitely in terms of his offensive game, I think playmaking is the next really big step. The next sort of development area, it's possible that some of his at-rim stuff will improve as he puts on more weight. I would be stunned if he's 6'8" and 190 in 2 years. But the flip side of that is, again, given how some of the defensive stuff is like, he doesn't navigate screens well. And it's something where it's like, I think there's more to it than just him being skinny. I think that's something that he'll continue to struggle with. And that's something the players can develop and get better at, obviously, just in terms of making better decisions of, hey, I'm going to try and, quickly blow this up, or, I'm going to slide under because I know that the guy I'm guarding can't shoot at all. There are things that guys can do to get better in terms of screen navigation. And I think that, again, there's a decent chunk of it that's just due to strength. And I'll be fascinated to see where he ends up next year. I think, odds are good that he'll probably transfer back up to a bigger conference. I mean, Atlantic 10 is not exactly a power conference, but it's certainly a bigger conference than Big West, right? And so the Dayton stuff, again, there are pluses and minuses from that of he really didn't play much and really wasn't all that effective, but He's clearly completely revamped his shot, gotten much, much more consistent with it, and that's showing up both at the free throw line and at the 3-point line. So really interesting to see. A lot to like on the offensive end. I have some questions on the defensive end, but the fact that he's a bigger guard makes it easier to mitigate those concerns. And if he continues to shoot like this on this kind of volume and also get to the free throw line at the level that he's getting to, there's definitely an NBA player in here. So really fun watch. That's the other thing is just, sometimes you're looking at prospects and it's like, I get the workman vibe, but man, this isn't as much fun. Hamad Musa's fun.
Yeah, he's just a fun player, right? And like he's one of the best, pick and roll playmakers right in the country. He's in the 92% percentile per synergy, and I love him off the dribble. He's so crafty. I think he has a ball on the string, right? It's just a matter of Cal Poly isn't the greatest team, right? So that kind of diminishes, how many eyes can get on him too. But, with a prospect, like him, he's definitely, in the right eyes as well too, just because of, he's kind of, getting a lot more buzz just because of, how lethal of a scorer he is. And at his size too, it's kind of, a rare archetype, right? And he's also, only 19 as well. So if you, blend all those together, you're definitely looking at, an NBA type player. And I think, like you mentioned, that we mentioned with Keaton too, strength and size and weight will come. But if they're already, showing these numbers, on the offensive side of the ball, with not having that size and muscle, it's a great sign as well. So shout out to, Anytime Knicks for, mentioning him to us. Definitely going to be a fun prospect to monitor for the season. And I think one of the things too, he's one of the best, off ball or on ball creators too, with his size too, because you mentioned, he's a guard, he's not a wing. And a few years ago too, it was kind of the trajectory of, Maxwell Lewis too. And obviously, Maxwell is definitely more of a wing than, Musa is, but, he played at Pepperdine, similar, vibe to Cal Poly, right? I think Maxwell had a lot more, mid-range game, and, he's obviously like archetypes too, like their strength and size was a little bit the same too. Maxwell Lewis was a little bit on the skinnier size too, but he went through a run too where he was absurd from downtown, and I think he had a little bit more juice, especially in the post ups, right, and a little bit more bag than Musa has. I think he definitely has a lot more off the dribble juice than Maxwell Lewis did. But I remember I had the same feeling, watching Maxwell Lewis at Pepperdine that I had watching Musa, that they're just a fun watch and definitely, an avenue for him in the NBA.
Yeah, there's one other thing that I want to throw out there before we wrap up, which is they have much more different games than Musa and Maxwell Lewis, but you mentioned sort of the developmental opportunity, and that's where the player that comes to mind for me is Brandon Podziemski. And again, they have very different games. I mean, Musa, despite his height, has 0 dunks this year. Brandon Podziemski is a much better vertical athlete. But, the way I think about it is, Podziemski at Illinois didn't really get much of a chance to show what he could do. He transferred down to a team that would let him have the ball in his hands more, and all of a sudden he's the 20th pick in the draft. And that's one of those things where, and, we sort of talked about it with Devin Booker and Zach LaVine in terms of how they develop their playmaking, right? It's like, if you only see the ball like once every few possessions and you're only playing 7.5 minutes per game, there are a lot of mistakes that you don't have the leeway to make that you can learn from, right? I mean, learning from failure is a pretty important part of improvement, in my personal opinion. And Musa just has a lot more studio space to explore with Cal Poly than he did at Dayton, and was likely going to have at Dayton, especially after the freshman year that he had. And so, the majority of the credit goes to him for, really just getting so much more consistent with his shot in a way that has transformed him into this 3-point bomber who's also getting to the line and converting almost at will at the line. That's the majority of it. But also, if he stayed at Dayton, does he get to average 20.6 points a game? I don't think he gets enough shots. And so it's one of those things where, weighing the sort of notion of, hey, do I want to transfer up to a more difficult conference, or in Musa's case, it's like, I'll take a step back in terms of the competition just so that I get the developmental opportunities of, hey, I've never seen this kind of read before. And if I was at Dayton, I wouldn't have the ball in my hands to see this kind of read. And so, again, I think the pick and roll scoring, he's spectacular at. You already covered that. But the pick and roll passing is something that, he'll need to continue to work on. But again, he'll get the chance to continue to work on it at Cal Poly in a way that, if he stayed at Dayton or, transferred to a team elsewhere in the Atlantic 10 or a similar level of competition to the Atlantic 10, maybe we don't ever see this breakout. And that's something that I think about a lot with prospects of maybe you would have been something entirely different if you'd gone to a team where you'd get the chance to show this side of your game more, and in showing this side of your game, get the chance to develop that side of your game more.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of upside with Musa, and I think he found the perfect fit for him at Cal Poly. And I think fit, it's not everything, but it's a majority of, how you can, fit into a system and, be the player that you can be, but is the scheme or coach going to allow you to, have that role? And he found the perfect fit at Cal Poly. I definitely think he's not a this year guy. I think I would want him to, transfer up and see if he can, display what he's displaying now at Cal Poly at, a power 4, right, school. But I think with him too, I know I mentioned Maxwell Lewis. Maxwell Lewis was definitely a lot more polarizing vertical athlete than, Musa is, but he's also, his finishes at the rim. Yeah, he's on the skinny side, but, his handle makes up for it. I mean, I love the wiggle to his game. I think he has real juice there. And I think there's a lot of potential for him. And, depending on, if he stays, if he declares, I would mostly think he would transfer, right? So those are kind of his, 2 options. But I really like the kid. I'm glad, we had the chance to talk about him. And I think there's a lot of strides that, he's making progressively towards the season. And, if Cal Poly, Nick gets into March Madness, then, he's going to have a real shot to be, in the limelight.
Yeah, shout out to you anytime, Nick. This was a fun exercise in a vacuum, and even more fun when it was an excuse for me to lift my head from the Excel spreadsheet for a little while yesterday while preparing for this show. All right, I think that will do it, but anything else before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, all good.
All right, so she is Paige Otto. You can find her at Paige Otto _ across all socials, and you can find her work on No Ceilings, NoCeilingsNBA.com, or No Ceilings TV YouTube. Anywhere you might find someone on social media, Paige is probably there doing stuff for No Ceilings and other outlets. You can find me on social media at NBA Johnson, and you can find my written work on NoCeilingsNBA.com. I've teased it a few times throughout the episode, but I have been working on a mammoth project for the last month that is finally complete and will be releasing a few hours after the audio for this podcast. So if you're Steven, wait a little bit. If you're everybody else, please go ahead and check out that article. I hope it's all right. I put a ton of work into it, so hopefully it's at least readable. But that will do it for us today. If you've been enjoying the show, please take the time to leave a rating and or review in whatever podcast player you might use. That's always much appreciated on our end. And if you have any feedback regarding the deep dives portion of the podcast, feel free to reach out to us either via social media, or you can reach me via email, nickaj.nba@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.